Hey, Ten, thanks for stopping by. I hope you're rested up, not too scared off by your first mission. I won't say it gets any easier, but you'll get used to the challenges of collecting in the field. I actually started off as a collector too. I remember my first time. I'm actually a bit of a hometown boy myself. I was recruited by the former leader of their Myrtle Beach bunker. On my first mission, well, it's a long story. Let's just say we escaped with the help of a Build-A-Bear employee, a giant Ferris wheel, and a dump truck. Anyways, today we have a special mission. From time to time we like to put ads in the yard sales section of the newspaper and look for old DVDs. I know, Craigslist would be a lot faster, but we're looking for old-timers that might have some pre-takeover stuff. 9 times out of 10, we get old hee-haw reruns or Kevin Hart movies. But every once in a while we get something useful. We try to be careful. Jacks aren't always dumb, and they catch on, so we need to be looking out for surveillance. We'll get there in a little bit. Make sure you have a full battery. We're going to be going to meet Caitlin. Caitlin lives out in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, just outside of Aner. Apparently she lives off the grid, only has a small generator, so don't expect any electricity or Wi-Fi. There's a stack of DVDs we haven't gotten to yet. They're over in Red's office. Why don't you go grab a stack and we'll do some work on the way there.
Think about Westward Expansion. Another term for this is manifest destiny. The United States had been facing westward from the time it was little colonies hugging along the coast of the Atlantic. In fact, after the French and Indian War, the British passed the Proclamation of 1763 to keep the Americans from moving westward and running into the Native American tribes that were there, trying to prevent any sort of conflict and more defense spending. After independence, the Americans gained all of the territory, took us all the way over to the Mississippi River, and then they started moving westward in earnest, trying to get as far west as possible. The problem was that the United States only had the territory of Mississippi, but they did not control the port of New Orleans. This is like having a cork in a bottle. Nobody could take their materials and go down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico and get their product to the open market. It would take 6 to 7 weeks to get a material from over here in western Pennsylvania over to New York City. Something that, if they had the Mississippi River, could take a couple of weeks. Well, the benefits of westward expansion were that the United States are going to continue to become more nationalistic. As people move out west, oddly enough, they began to feel more American. There's a certain amount of Americanness that deals with individualism. Think of this as the pioneer spirit. By moving out west, people felt themselves as rugged individuals, and the common man became sort of the embodiment of democracy. In fact, this goes back to Thomas Jefferson feeling that we should have an agrarian nation and everybody should be farmers. This does lead to some sectional disputes, and we're going to talk about national policies dealing with the South, the West, and the North, and how they felt about things like cheap land, internal improvements, industry and its development, the tariff, which is a tax on imports, and expansion of slavery. The one key thing that you need to remember is that when people moved to the West, they took their values with them. So if you were from the North and you moved into the West, you typically had Northern values, and in the South, the same thing. If a Northerner moved to the West, they typically wanted to have free soil, and when Southerners moved to the West, they typically were for the expansion of slavery. So what you need to know is the 5 major land acquisitions. The first was the Louisiana Purchase. You can see that in the middle of the map here. The second was the Oregon Settlement or Territory Treaty. The third was the annexation of Texas. And the fourth was the Mexican Cession. The first, by the way, was the original land acquisition after the American Revolution.
10, try to stay awake over there. I know old Betsy here has a cozy car and the sun is out. This is a working trip. We can't keep you awake and look out for tails and checkpoints. My great-granddad Powley. Great. Anyways, Pop's always said, you ain't paranoid if they really are out to get you, so we gotta keep a lookout. Of course, he also said that multitasking's a myth, so get off of YouTube and get focused. Anyways, we're heading out of the Wi-Fi zones. Man, Caitlin does live way out in the middle of nowhere.
First of all, Jefferson was elected in 1800. It's often called the Revolution of 1800. The Federalists had been in charge with Washington and Adams for 12 years. Jefferson comes into power as a Democratic Republican, wanting a smaller weaker central government, strict interpretation of the Constitution. There was nothing at that point in our history that suggested that a new political party could take over without violence. So the fact that the Federalists, which still controlled the military, allowed Jefferson to take over was a fairly revolutionary concept. Jefferson wants that strict interpretation, and yet he is the person that's going to double the size of the United States, largely by using a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson wanted to have the Port of New Orleans. He sends a delegation down to the French to discuss the Port of New Orleans, and his ambassadors arrive, and they're allowed to make, I believe, an offer of $5 million to rent access to the Port of New Orleans. And the French, who are sick and tired of being in the North American territories, offered to give him all of the Louisiana territory for $10 million. And they sign the deal, and it goes back to Jefferson. And Jefferson, while it doesn't allow this in the Constitution for the president to buy land from other sovereign nations, he does it anyways, arguing that the Constitution doesn't prohibit him from making this deal, violating his core beliefs for the good of the country. Ironically, Hamilton, the person that had wanted loose interpretation, called him out on it, and he said that the president should not be doing this sort of thing. So Hamilton wanted to strictly interpret this. Now, Jefferson got a great deal. If you worked it out, it turned out to be about 10 cents an acre for all of the territory here you see in green. This also sets a future precedent for expansion for future presidents. All the territory to the west of that big green blob is also going to be expanded into later, within the 1800s. So the impact of the Louisiana Purchase was a focus on westward expansion. Now that we have the Port of New Orleans, we can move into those other territories. This picture below is going to sometimes be called American Progress. You have Lady Liberty or an angel or whatever your interpretation is facing westward, and you can see that if you break this into chunks, the farthest to the east, that is technologically advanced, and the further west you go, the more savage or uncivilized the picture. You have Lady Liberty here, who's bringing all of this good technology and civilization out west. You can see that you have farmers following miners, following savagery. The Native Americans are running away, almost in fear. Sometimes this is called manifest destiny. But the real important thing is, now that we've faced west, we can get all of our economics down into the Gulf of Mexico. So you can be a specialized farmer in Indiana or Ohio, put your specialized crops onto a boat, sail it down the Ohio, into the Mississippi River, into the Gulf of Mexico, and you can get it to the east coast of the United States before the stuff spoils, or you can get it over into Europe and make even more money. More land also means more states. Americans are moving to the west, they're buying cheap land, and eventually so much land is available that pretty much everybody, most male, had land. So the requirement to have property to vote was eventually just removed entirely. And new states came in as equal to the original states. So Westerners, which were these quote-unquote common men, had equality with those richer, more established Eastern families, especially in the Senate, where every state gets 2 votes. Sometimes this is referred to as universal white male suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote, and by 1830, nearly all men had the right to vote. Politics became a national pastime, almost a national holiday. As white men were receiving the right to vote universally or all over, African Americans were taken away, even in the free territories of the North.
What's that? Sorry, I thought I saw a white Cadillac following us. Yeah, the takeover. That happened pretty slowly. The rise of the internet promised a lot of free information. The problem was that there was so much information, it was like a fire hose in people's faces. People needed to organize that chaos, and what ended up happening was this self-selection process. Some people call it an echo chamber. The fancy name is confirmation bias. People went online to find information that made them feel smart or safe. So they found news sites that gave them the news they wanted to hear, and they didn't actually think about the important issues. They didn't want to. Social media sites like Twitter and Facebook came along, and they created algorithms that fed news stories and memes directly into people's media streams that basically did the same thing. It's part of the reason why the internet's still allowed to exist today. And also, it's because it allows every wacko conspiracy theory to exist, so that when there is a real problem, it gets lumped in with all the rest. When in the real physical world, people began to sort themselves out, massive partisanship followed. No problems were taken on, much less solved. No one understood each other anymore. No one had any empathy for their opponent anymore. Winning became more important than helping anybody else out. Then these strongman groups came along. APOC wasn't the first. They just built on the fears and the infrastructure that was already there. I'm going to go get philosophical. The point is that we need to teach people how to be historians again, to think critically, to evaluate evidence, analyze their sources. If we don't really do that, none of this other stuff matters. That's why the powers that be are so threatened by us. If we can teach people to think for themselves and then reshape the past, we can control the future. We need all of that context you're getting for us, so keep working hard.
Andrew Jackson is referred to as the first Western president. He is often seen as the champion of the common man. In 1790, Native Americans had this amount of territory, the green area in this map. By 1860, which is the Civil War era, the Native American tribes have been pushed westward across the Mississippi River to the territory that you see here in green. And then by 1890, they've been put on reservations. This all starts with Andrew Jackson and his official policy against Native Americans. Previously, there hadn't been any official policies. Washington had tried treaty negotiations, but Jackson makes it official. The policy of the American government was to remove Native Americans to the west, to push them as far west as possible in order to get more land for white settlers. There was resistance to this. Seminoles in Florida resisted the westward expansion. They fought for 20 years before they were ultimately defeated and moved to Oklahoma. There was assimilationist efforts, which means trying to act similar to the white dominant culture. The best example of this is the Cherokee in Georgia, who became farmers. In fact, most of them were plantation owners. Some of them even owned slaves. They were acting as white Southern plantation owners, but Georgia didn't recognize their whiteness, apparently. They wanted to have white land control of that territory, and they took the Native American lands. The Cherokee sued Georgia and went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, and the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee that they should be able to keep their land, and Georgia shouldn't be able to take it over. Jackson, on the other hand, said that he had a military and the Supreme Court didn't, so he sided with Georgia, violating the checks and balances systems, and essentially pushed the Native Americans off the land. This led to forced relocations. You probably know this as the Trail of Tears. In 1838, there was a forced march of Native Americans from the southeast to Oklahoma. You can see the different trails here. Another consequence of this was the plantations in the south. More plantations were being built, and they were expanding further into the west. This meant that there was a need for more slaves. Cotton and the cotton gin had become developed in the 1790s, and now cotton became a major cash crop. So this means as these plantations are expanding out to the west, that slaves are being moved into the west. And that means that slave owners are selling slave families to the west, and there's a lot of breaking up of families. There's a lot of breaking up of slave communities, and while maybe physically some of the slave owners weren't that bad, if it is an economic system, they were making money off of this by breaking up families as they took their property out west. And you can see here the expansion in 1820 of all the territory away from the east coast and into the west coast. Talk about the Nullification Crisis. Andrew Jackson is the president at this point, and during his time in office, there was rising sectional differences, largely based on the fact that the sections had different economies. The South was largely an agricultural, slave-based economy, and they wanted to support their plantation system, and the North was becoming an industrial, wage-based economy. The key difference between the two sections is slavery, and that's going to be the key economic issue as we go forward towards the Civil War. And you cannot understand this notion of states' rights versus federal rights without understanding that it's based on this idea of extension of slavery. If you eliminate slavery, you eliminate the Southern economics, and that causes problems for them. Now, the Nullification Crisis of 1832 foreshadows the Civil War. The immediate cause of the crisis, while it is a long-term issue over slavery, is about tariffs. In the South, they were an agricultural system. They had to buy a lot of their manufactured products, and a tariff is a tax on imported goods. The North wants a tariff because it's designed to protect what they called infant industries or domestic industries, wanted people to buy American. The South doesn't like this because while a tariff, it provides an incentive to buy American products, it also causes American companies to increase the price of their goods. If a British roll of cloth costs $5, as you see here, an American company isn't going to charge $4 for their roll of cloth. They're going to raise their price to $4.50. So that means higher prices for manufactured goods all over. So from the southern perspective, they produce cash crops. They were afraid that it was going to raise prices. They were also afraid that other countries would raise their tariff, and that would mean less sales or less profit. They were buying manufactured goods, and they didn't want to have artificially increased prices of goods. From a Western perspective, they supported the North, mostly for pragmatic reasons. They wanted the North to build railroads, roads, and canals, and the South was against this. So the Westerners wanted to have the cheap way to get into the West and the North. And the South began to see this relationship between the North and the West as a conspiracy, that the North and the West were banding together to take away their way of life, which essentially means slavery.
Man, I forgot how long a drive this was. But for the most part, the people you see on the street are pretty good people. Most of them want to go to work, they can feed their families, have a safe place to sleep at night. The party tried to recruit people that they think will make good party members. Remember all those tests you were forced to take in school? And some of them, not all of them, but some of them were testing you for your party aptitude. Now, for the most part, our biggest problem with the unaffiliated are these squealers. They aren't really out to end the underground. In fact, most of them don't even realize the dictatorship they're living under. These normal, good people see something they don't understand, something out of the usual, and they call the cops. Even the regular cops probably aren't in on the APOC scheme, but their radio transmissions are monitored, so we always have to be careful. It's better to be safe than sorry.
And this is what led to the Nullification Crisis. You can see John C. Calhoun here. He was from South Carolina. He was promoting a states' rights argument. Essentially, he wanted to declare the tariff null and void. He argued that states had the right to do this. Jackson, for his part, said that no, that is incorrect. The states do not have their right to do that. Even though he was sympathetic to their reasoning, as president, he saw himself as the leader of the federal government, had to defend the federal government, and argued that if you nullify an act of Congress, that would fatally weaken the Union. If the South can argue that they can nullify a tariff, then what's going to happen when the North, when the government tries to pass a tax, say, on cheese in Wisconsin? Wisconsin will just threaten to leave the Union. So Jackson argued that the South cannot do this. The South began implying that they might secede. Jackson saw this as treason, and he acted in a very clear manner. The old general took charge. He ordered a naval blockade of Charleston, pushed a force bill through Congress which authorized him to use military force to collect the tariff from the Southerners. Ultimately, what happens is that there's a compromise reached. The South promises not to use nullification. In this case, the tariff is lowered to make the Southerners happy, and there's a balance reached for a little while. But even though the threat is averted, the South never backed off its belief on nullification, still hasn't. And it goes back to that Virginia and Kentucky resolution. Now, if you remember, the Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court case, said that nullification occurs with the Supreme Court through judicial review. But the Southerners and South Carolina in particular here were still holding on to that states' rights nullification argument. So nullification and slavery are the two factors that are going to lead to civil war. The United States claimed Oregon because of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was sent by Jefferson in the early 1800s. You can see the path that they took, and they got all the way up to modern-day Oregon and Washington. Oregon was not part of Louisiana Territory, so they had technically not been in the United States while traveling through that area. But plenty of Americans moved there anyways. There's a lot of fur there, and there's a ton of fertile land there. Beautiful territory. And the occupation led to a need to defend the claims of people living there. The issue was that it was jointly claimed by the British and the Americans until 1840. Now, in 1840, there's a lot of stuff going on in the U.S., and it's going to be jointly occupied until then, when there's a treaty negotiated which set the modern boundary line where it is today. The Americans didn't want to fight with the British because they're about to start a war with Mexico over Texas and California.
Hey, 10, we're almost there. I think. There are not many road signs out here. Hope we don't run into any gators or snakes. I told you about the squealers, but the real threats to the underground are the Arnolds. I guess some people just snap and can't handle the pressure of this lifestyle. It's always a danger when we recruit people. Don't be offended if Gamma's keeping a close eye on you. We've lost a few promising people in the past. Sometimes they try to blend back into society and usually get caught. They usually give up some information. Usually APOC promises them something in return. Traitors. Sometimes everything seems fine and they come back from a mission and they're just changed. We haven't figured out if it's something they collected or just snapped or what, but these are the animals that are most dangerous because they know some of our secrets. None of us knows everything about the underground. Only a few of us know anything about the bunker itself. Oh hey, here's the house. I think we're here. Let's go check this out.
Coming up next on the History Underground.
Hey Caitlin, it's good to meet you. I hear you might have some discs that we can buy.
I remember Mr. Pally's class. He was nice. Thought he was funny, but... well, he was nice. Here it is. That was the newspaper from the day they took him away.
We know that you have something.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have anything.
Hey, you better be done. Pack it up. Grab the discs. Get ready to jump.